I got a tip for you. Come closer. It's complicated. No, it's the new podcast on the Legal AF channel with Renato and Asha, and it's called It's Complicated, but they make it uncomplicated. They're former FBI agents. Asha is a Yale professor on national security, and Renato is a world-class lawyer, and they're both legal commentators and analysts. And we've got them now exclusively on Legal AF for It's Complicated. And here's a clip.
No kidding. Well, I will feel like the Trump administration doesn't stop when it comes to Harvard. And that's really interesting.
Well, Harvard is refusing to bend the knee. We know that the Trump administration threatened to take away billions of dollars in funding unless Harvard acquiesced to all kinds of things, including control over hiring and admission of students and things like that. We talked about that in an earlier episode, and Harvard was like, yeah, homie, don't play that. And so this is sort of the next step of the government using basically every lever of power that it has over these institutions. And one of those is basically granting permission, not just for Harvard, but for institutions of higher education across the country to enroll international students. That is something that schools have to get essentially permission from the government to do. And we can talk about the process that they do that. I'll just say, Renato, that it's really interesting because although the face of this is Kristi Noem, who isn't, she's not a legal eagle. I mean, she barely understands habeas corpus. It's clear to me that someone, or not someone, but a lot of people or at least some people in this administration are really carefully understanding where these levers of power are. Even kind of going down into various agency regulations and kind of using those in a way that we did not see in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, this is really something because the whole thing started with a supposed mistake, right? And it's just escalated and escalated and escalated. And I don't really know where it's going to go next, but Harvard has certainly convinced me, based on some of what I've read, that this is sort of existential for them in many ways because they have a very substantial proportion of international students. That's a very big part of their body.
It's a quarter of their student body. Mm-hmm. And look, I work in higher education. I actually work in admission, so I can speak to this. International students are often paying full freight at universities.
We like those.
Yeah, and so people need to understand that there's often like a redistribution of the money that they're getting from international students to be able to give to financial aid to students who are admitted with need within the United States. So, schools like Harvard, I know they're considered to be elite and, people imagine that only rich people go there. Same with, Yale and Princeton, but often these elite schools have the most resources to be able to go to make their schools accessible to people who otherwise couldn't afford to go. So, they give pretty substantial need-based financial aid and many or most of their programs. And they rely on international students to be able to do this, apart from the fact that international students are also a huge source of talent, right? Particularly in STEM. We want researchers from India and China and Iran and, all these places to come because, they are contributing to our basically intellectual and research base here in the U.S. So if we lose that actually makes us lose a certain competitive edge that we have.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Asha. There's almost a brain drain element to it, right? Yeah. Where, the United States in the past, for example, after World War II, there was all these German scientists who were being shuttled off to Russia and to the United States in order to try to gain access to their scientific abilities and knowledge. And here, one thing that the United States has always had as an advantage is that some of the most educated and brilliant people from around the world come to the United States to study. They also sometimes will end up, because they like the culture and they get into this ecosystem here, they end up staying here and work for U.S. companies. And really, that's being endangered here. And another thing that I read is that this actually potentially has impact on our relationship with other countries. China, I believe, from what I've read, is the number one country that international students come from that go to Harvard. And a lot of them are just getting so fed up with all of this that it really could have an impact on U.S.-China relationship over time, because really people who come to Harvard and schools like that to study are really, I'd say, a source of direct impact and information over to China of a real picture of the United States rather than a caricature that's spread by propaganda.
Well, it's a way that we can exercise soft power, because they come here, they see, as you said, our culture, they go back. I mean, in a lot of ways, we're creating cultural ambassadors in the same way that we send like people with the Peace Corps or the Fulbright program to other countries to sort of be cultural ambassadors. Bringing in international students helps our soft power around the United States, which is something that the Trump administration has been systematically destroying. I mean, the way that they dismantled USAID, which was another way that we did that. So yeah, this has a lot of repercussions. One thing that I want to make clear to the listeners, this particular issue is different than what the State Department has been doing in revoking student visas. We've talked about that before, where they've been revoking student visas, arresting and detaining some of these students some of them are still in detention. This is different. This isn't about revoking student visas, which, by the way, a federal judge has already put on hold through an injunction. This is kind of coming at it from the other side, right? This is basically saying this school is not certified to receive international students. In other words, students can't get a visa to even come, because in order to obtain a visa, a student visa, an F1 visa or a J1 visa, to come and study in the United States, you have to show that you are that you've been admitted to and that you plan to attend a student exchange visitor program certified school, SEVP. I don't know how you say that as an acronym, but you have to show that. And basically the government certifies whether you have that status. And that's what's at stake here. That is what the Department of Homeland Security has basically pulled from Harvard. And what that means is that all of the students who've been admitted to Harvard at this point, and we're basically at the tail end of admission season, this is when international students are trying to get their student visas to come and enroll in the fall, they can't get a visa. And I believe that the students who have student visas essentially are now ineligible to remain at Harvard because they are no longer attending a certified school. In other words, they would have to now transfer to another school that is certified and pretty much have to go through that whole visa process again to get their visa reissued to attend that other school.
Yeah, that's, I think, the key point that people need to understand from a factual perspective is that, just like, for example, I mean, some people might be familiar with H1B1 visas, where an employer is sponsoring. Here, it's an educational institution. And so if you're a foreign student, let's say you're a sophomore or a junior, you've been attending Harvard. Now, in order to remain in the United States, you've got to go through the trouble, and it's not a small chore to be like, okay, now I got to get into Stanford or get into Yale or get into Princeton or wherever, and I've got to go through a lot of hoops to do that. Maybe I won't get in. Maybe I will. There's probably not going to be spots at all these other schools for these people. It's a huge hassle, and right now we're at a time of year where that may not even be possible for them at all. It's
probably not possible, Renato. Again, I do admissions, so typically for these programs, I mean, frankly, for whether it's undergrad or graduate programs, offers are typically made around March or April. And students are required to decide where they are enrolling by May at the latest, usually. And for international students, because I'm tangentially involved in this process at Yale, you have to get the ball rolling very early in order to secure your student visa to enroll in the fall. So there's something called a CVIS portal. So once a school becomes certified by DHS to accept students, and by the way, we can come back to this, but there's actually kind of two different entities here, and DHS approves schools to accept students on H1 visas, which are students who are enrolled, I think, in degree programs. But there's also something called a J1 visa, which is a student exchange program. And I think that's for students or people who come and they're coming as students, but they're not necessarily, I think, enrolled in a degree program. That's administered by the Department of State. I used to have au pairs for many years, and they were technically coming on a J1 visa. So when they came, they had to get a certain amount of credits, but they weren't enrolled in a degree program while they were here. And I think there might be other like fellowships and things like that students come for 1 year, some months to do research and things like that. So that's administered by the Department of State. It's important that what Kristi Noem has claimed to do is basically ban Harvard from accepting both of these status students. Some question on whether she can do that on behalf of the Department of State, but we can get back to that with the lawsuit that Harvard has filed. But basically, once a school is certified, they have access to this portal. And the portal is what allows them to essentially submit documents on behalf of the student to, I guess, DHS or, to the entity at this DHS who issues to the student something called an I-20. And the I-20, this is a very bureaucratic process. I'm just letting people know how involved it is. The I-20 is needed by the student in order to get an appointment, to get their interview, to get their visa. I know students who right now are struggling to even get appointments by early August, which they need in order to get their visa, because there's also all these like bans that the Trump administration is doing on different countries. So time is of the essence this year in particular for students to be able to get a visa to enroll in the fall. So by doing this, even with litigation, they're potentially harming Harvard's ability to even enroll these students in the fall.
Yeah, it's meant to be punitive in Harvard. It's meant to debilitate Harvard. And I do want to pivot here and talk about a little bit about what Harvard did this morning. So we're recording this on Friday, May 23rd. And just this morning, Harvard filed a lawsuit. And once again, I mean, I think you and I as Yaleys and in you as a Princeton alum are jealous. Perhaps they're the ones sort of out in front on this. But they filed another lawsuit. The same, those lawyers who wrote the letter we talked about before, Bill Burke, who has represented Trump in the past, Robert Hur, I think from 4 seasons ago, so to speak, was investigating Biden, and some other lawyers now from Jenner and Block have filed this lawsuit. And in many ways, Asha, it's similar in tone and in claim to the prior suit that you and I have discussed in a prior episode, because at its core, it's a First Amendment argument. They're saying we are being discriminated against as Harvard University for our viewpoint, the viewpoints of our faculty, the viewpoints of our community, and that is unconstitutional under the First Amendment.
Yeah, they're bringing it back to that original demand by the Trump administration. And this gets to what you characterized. You referenced a mistake. And just so our listeners understand what you're talking about, the Trump administration sent this letter to Harvard basically saying, we want control, this is how you need to hire people. You need to hire a certain amount of MAGA people as faculty and admit MAGAs as students or whatever, pretty much is what they were saying. They called it ideological diversity, but I'm pretty sure that that's what they have in mind. And that's the part that Harvard said, no way. And then it came out that the Trump administration claimed, we didn't really mean to send that. That was a mistake. And now Harvard's made this big deal out of it. We could have resolved this. But clearly it's not a mistake because, now they're taking these actions against Harvard because of Harvard's refusal to comply. That's what Harvard's argument is. I think it's important to note, though, what the DHS's argument is. DHS has asked, or Kristi Noem has asked for all disciplinary records from Harvard of non-immigrant students that have been enrolled at Harvard over the last 5 years. And not just their records. Noem wants Harvard to turn over electronic records, videos, audio of quote unquote illegal and dangerous or violent activity by non-immigrant students on campus. So that's the piece that the government claims that Harvard hasn't complied with, that justifies them revoking this SEVP certification.
Yeah, and it's actually, I think, worth noting. I think it's a really important point that you made, Asha, because really part of what's going on here is this is the Trump administration understanding how to use their soft power in part to create huge problems for people they don't like, right? Or people who are standing up against them. And I will just say from my side of the aisle, right? I'm a practicing lawyer at a big mega law firm like some of the ones that are representing Harvard, is that when clients do get these sorts of inquiries and requests for data and so on, it can be incredibly disruptive. And by the way, I'll just say, this is not the only industry that they're looking at. They're all over the place. If you go in the news, there's plenty. We're talking about Harvard today. There's plenty of other industries now that are in groups that are all kind of part of the Trump administration kind of watchful eye, who are getting subpoenas. And
well, Media Matters is being investigated by the Federal Communications Commission, and we're not going to be able to cover that today. Maybe we will in a future episode, but yeah, that's an example of a media organization that they're using another regulatory agency to go after.
Yeah. So my point is that when you get a subpoena like that from a federal agency saying, hey, we're taking a look at, let's say in this case, students and whether or not they're engaging in violent activities or whatever they're supposedly looking at, that creates all sorts of burdens and issues and problems and so forth. It really can turn kind of everything upside down for a company, like you mentioned, obviously a nonprofit, or in this case, a university. So, this is something where Harvard's drawing a line and saying, no, we're going to fight back. They've already done that before. But it comes at costs. And right now, the cost is a real upheaval for its student body, and potentially, like you said, not only the loss of the revenue that it makes off of international students, which is not insignificant, but Harvard can afford it, but it's also essentially impacting and upending and potentially undermining their entire community. Yeah.
So quickly, the main arguments that Harvard is making is, one, that all of this is basically a fig leaf to retaliate, as you just said, because it doesn't want to give up its academic freedom in determining who it wants to hire and what it wants to teach and who it wants to admit. That this is basically a First Amendment violation because it's an attempt by the government to retaliate for its exercising its own First Amendment activities. But it's also making the argument that this move is an arbitrary and capricious action under the Department of Homeland Security regulations themselves. In other words, the regulations that govern how schools are certified, and more importantly, the steps and grounds on which a school can be decertified are not being followed.
Yeah. And this is, by the way, talk about connections to prior episodes. We talked a lot about the Administrative Procedure Act. That is, in fact, what they're invoking here in a number of their claims. The Administrative Procedure Act, and essentially saying, as in some of the other contexts we were talking about, where there was government action that was arbitrary, that essentially there's really a violation of some of the sort of basic administrative law that we have that ensures that agencies are acting in a fair way, in an open way, in a way that is not just completely arbitrary. There's also just also could draw a connection to another episode, Asha, a due process claim. We've talked a lot about due process, why it's important in the context of people, for example, being whisked away and disappeared to other countries, but it also applies here. And really, what due process is a constitutional protection that ensures that when the government's taking anything away from you, that they're doing it where there's actually a procedure in place so that you can be heard, so that you can challenge this, and so on. And that is not happening in this case, according to Harvard.
Yes. So Harvard points out that decertifying a school that has already received certification to accept and enroll international students, that decertification is exceedingly rare. And I thought this was really interesting. The complaint says there's only 2 reported cases in which a school has challenged the revocation of its certification, and each involved repeated or widespread misconduct and noncompliance with the governing regulations. So one of them had 89 violations of regulatory reporting requirements, and the other one was engaged in a visa fraud scheme. So it's kind of pointing out that this is sort of a very unusual move for DHS to take. And as you mentioned, the DHS regulations actually lays out the procedure that the DHS has to follow to decertify. It has to provide notice. And again, this is sort of, we're seeing this in other contexts. You have to give, if you granted something and then you're taking it away, that could be legal status in the US. That could be a certification to accept international students. You have to provide notice that you are going to withdraw it. You have to give a reason for why you're doing it. And you have to give an opportunity for that entity, at least in this case for the school, to either correct the issue that they're not in compliance or whatever, or to appeal it. And in fact, these regulations technically give an institution up to 60 days to go through an appeals process when something is when this certification is revoked, precisely so it doesn't cause this kind of chaos and wreak the kind of havoc that DHS is clearly trying to do here. There's an exception, Renato, which says that at its discretion, DHS can do it immediately. I'm assuming that that's like in some sort of egregious, crazy situation where they, I don't know, where they have to do it. But I'm guessing that is what DHS is going to rely on. And it's going to say Harvard is basically housing terrorists. And so we have to do this immediately.
Right. I think the idea is, because DHS, of course, was created after 9/11, that's like, oh my God, the 9/11 bombers, right? Or at this particular place, right?
There's a sleeper cell.
There's a sleeper cell. We got to go after him. And so, well, look, I mean, we'll see what happens. Obviously, this lawsuit, the complaint looks very strong, which is not a surprise when you have kind of arbitrary action and you're against an entity that can afford some of the best lawyers in the United States, right? So it really, I think I wouldn't bet against Harvard in this lawsuit, but I think it remains to be seen.
Well, I wouldn't bet against Harvard, but again, I think the issue right now is timing. So first of all, Harvard needs an injunction immediately. Otherwise, it's literally not going to be able to enroll at least a good chunk of the students that it just admitted, just because they're not going to be able to get their visas in time. But I think there's also a certain amount of damage, Renato, that is going to be done even if Harvard prevails, right? Because even if Harvard gets an injunction, that's not necessarily indefinite, right? That's not a ruling on the merits. And any student who's coming to Harvard is going to have to wonder, hey, I'm coming all the way to the United States, or maybe I'm in the middle of my studies. What if this gets taken away, in 6 months? And they might choose to not go to Harvard or go somewhere else. And frankly, speaking as someone who's at a different institution, I think this harms all schools, because I think there's going to be a certain number of international students who are just going to say, screw it, I don't even want to come to the US to study, because if this can happen at Harvard, it can happen anywhere else, and it really can.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it imposes all sorts of other costs at Harvard. I mean, this lawsuit, as I said, looks strong, and that's in terms of litigating out this lawsuit. But of course, the Trump administration could just do something else and something else and something else. And it's just a constant pressure that they're putting and overwhelming them and incurring costs and incurring problems where, the Trump administration does this, poses tons of costs and upheaval and problems at Harvard. Harvard spends all this money, goes to court, maybe they win an injunction. And even if the Trump administration changes course, they can always just do something else a few weeks later. Yeah.
Well, good luck to Harvard. I hope that they prevail in court and get an injunction soon.
Man, it's hard for me to cheer for Harvard. Can Trump go after the Chicago Cubs? That would be another. As a White Sox fan, that would be even better from my perspective.
Welcome back. We're so pleased and honored to have Renato and Asha with us. Asha will be doing regular hot takes as well under a new playlist we're going to call Ask Asha. And you can see, by the way, they just described things related to the attack by Donald Trump on Harvard and higher education, why it matters, and why their voices need to be heard here on the Legal AF channel. So come to Legal AF, hit the subscribe button, hit reminders. You'll know about postings like when It's Complicated goes up every week, and all the other content 8 to 10 times a day that we do exclusively on Legal AF. We want to be the home for law and politics analysis for you. One-stop shopping here on Legal AF, the Substack, and also on Legal AF, the podcast, every Wednesday and Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the Meidas Touch Network and replayed over here on Legal AF. So until my next Legal AF contribution, I'm Michael Popak. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.